going to start right now. I know we'll have other folks that'll join based on the RSVPs that came in, but welcome everyone. My name is Chris Neidl. I am the co-founder of the Open Air Collective and really excited for today's teach-in/webinar with a number of Open Air's community members. For those of you who are not familiar with Open Air is a all-volunteer global network that's focused on advancing carbon dioxide removal through both R&D projects and advocacy, which I'll explain a second. Well, I'll also provide some information at the end about how you can learn more about Open Air and join. And what we want to do today, because we know that a lot of folks are maybe just hearing about Carbontech or carbon removal or carbon utilization as an overall piece of the climate emergency and how we respond to it. So what I wanted to do is start with an overview and kind of talk about Carbontech in the city. What is it that we're excited about? Where do we see the opportunities for cities, particularly like New York City, to really play a role in advancing it? And then we're going to go right into a brief survey that Adida Chowdhury, one of our advocates at Open Air, is going to just talk through so that you have a real sense of what is this technology? What does it actually look like? What would it do? It's a very early, young space, but we're seeing some really cool companies emerge and ones that could have a footprint in New York. So Adita is going to run us through a list of some of these new companies to give you a sense. And then we're really excited to have Sal Brzezowski is going to present an analysis on how the whole Carbontech, carbon removal fits within the broader climate policy of cities like New York, which are trying to get to net zero and that are looking at things like offsets. So they are going to talk about how the Carbontech fits into that picture. And then we're really happy to have a discussion afterward. We'll take some questions from you folks. And then we're also joined by two other members of ours, Adina Banyan and Jason Hockman. Adina is a sustainability consultant for Latitude Compliance and deals with the real nitty gritty of how buildings comply with New York's net zero climate law. And Jason has a front row seat of the direct air capture and carbon removal industry. He's a founding member of the DAC, senior director of the DAC coalition. So he can give us even more insights to what's on the horizon and what can we start, what do we expect to see start showing up in the urban context. So let me go ahead and again, get us acquainted with the subject matter and introduce some of the main subjects I think that'll help illuminate it. One is this idea. I just got back from Glasgow for the COP26 conference. It was really interesting to see how, the idea of taking carbon from the air and utilizing it as a resource rather than as just a waste product has really started to surface. It was quite an obscure marginal idea, but I think it's starting to become more central. This is a great quote from the legendary sustainable architect, William McDonough, from a few years ago, really kind of putting this idea forward into the world. And a number of different concepts that overlap and are somewhat related to each other have, I think, emerged when we talk about carbon utilization and removal. And one is circular carbon. The idea, if you're putting carbon into the world, we should take it back and utilize it for things that add value and displace other carbon emissions. Carbon to value is a term that definitely has landed here in New York for reasons that I'll explain, but it's this idea of not looking at carbon as a waste, but as something valuable that we can actually do things with rather than solely as a pollutant. And then probably the term that's become most prominent, and the one that I'll use mostly tonight, is Carbontech. So this is an industry, and these are technologies that remove, capture, or utilize carbon in ways that are beneficial for the climate and for the environment. Now, more specifically, when we talk about Carbontech, what are they? I just sort of referenced it, but categorically, I think there's sort of three buckets that are sort of helpful to get acquainted with the main idea. One is technologies like direct air carbon capture, or DAC, that remove carbon dioxide from the air. So this is carbon that's already emitted, already in the air, and you're taking that out and you're either putting it in stuff or doing things with it. The other is point source CO2 capture that stops carbon from going up into the atmosphere and takes that and similarly puts it somewhere where it's stable or does something valuable with it that displaces other emissions. And then certainly related to that is the other part is if you're either stopping carbon or you're removing it from the air, what we do with it really, really matters in terms of its climate impact. And so there's whole categories of technology that utilize carbon dioxide in just such ways. And this is a thing, again, that was quite obscure, I would say, even a couple of years ago, as someone who's now been pretty immersed in this world for a number of years now, but it's really started to become a thing that's registered. Real companies are out in the world raising real money and now making real products. And so the Carbontech revolution, quote unquote, is early, but it has begun. And potentially it's an enormous economic opportunity. Some estimates in that New York Times article, as well as the nonprofit think tank and do tank Carbon 180, estimated to be over $1 trillion industry ultimately. So it's not a marginal thing. And here are some of the companies, just to give you a quick view. I can't fit them all on here. Diverse, that really span a number of different industries. Some of the exciting carbon tech companies that have emerged, and Jason might even give us a count of this later. It's amazing. It seems like every week there's new companies that are being announced. So it's moving quite quickly. And what's really interesting to us, and why we wanted to focus this on New York, is that many of us are from New York. Open Air is a global community, but New York is doing some really interesting things that I think are exceptional globally, not just nationally or regionally, in regard to carbon tech. New York is really making some moves. It's recognized the need for it vis-a-vis its own climate objectives, but it recognizes the opportunity of carbon tech as an economic sector. So New York has done some significant things in recent months and years to really try to take a lead in this sector and sort of seize the mantle, I guess you could say, as a carbon tech hub. One is that we launched, it was NYSERDA in conjunction with Greentown Labs and a few other partners, launched the first in the nation, maybe even the globe, an accelerator for carbon to value or carbon tech companies that is actually based in Brooklyn. So that got going in 2020. Really cool. It's called the Carbon to Value Initiative. Recommend you look it up. And then shortly after, in September, the US Department of Energy it had a round of grants that it released for direct air capture companies, machines that pull carbon from the atmosphere. And it was interesting, of the, I think, 16 to 18 grants that were awarded, 5 of them were in New York State, more than any other place, spread all throughout universities and private companies throughout the state. And then in April, right around Earth Day, the state announced a $10 million investment in its Carbon Tech Development Initiative. This was focused on research and development and early commercialization of promising technologies. And then a similar entrepreneurship-focused program of almost the same amount was announced later that summer. So these are unique things that New York State is doing to really try to capture the lead in carbon tech. Now, the question that we sort of started off with, and that the title reveals, is, okay, well, that's interesting. What though do cities, does the urban environment, do urban settings have a particular role to play in the evolution and growth of carbon tech? And a lot of times, if you may have read about or been hearing about technologies like direct air capture or other solutions, they're often rendered solely in industrial sort of scale. And you see pictures like this, where it's out in the middle of a field or a desert, and that certainly doesn't scream urban or city to most folks. But the reality is, we think, if you look at developments and you're sort of following the trends, we think that cities, like in many other areas of climate tech or in energy, have a really important role. And we think that a lot of the forms of carbon tech, I think, that are going to grow the fastest are ones that are not gigantic, but rather are distributed, embedded in the built environment. And here we see cities having a lot of opportunities for these types of applications to take off. And again, we're talking about not only locating this infrastructure within cities, but potentially within buildings themselves, and even some interesting research and early commercialization for the embedding of carbon removal and utilization in products. So I come from a solar background, and I tend to look at direct air capture and other forms of carbon dioxide removal through the lens of solar. And certainly solar's takeoff, solar last year was by the International Energy Agency was declared to be the cheapest form of electricity ever. And that happened about 30 years ahead of schedule. Not too long ago, it was very expensive. And a big part of that story was because solar is modular, and it can be embedded and it can be integrated into buildings, and that allowed it to scale up very fast and for costs to come down. And so when we saw in the solar case, where the growth rate you can see after around 2010 taking sort of a vertical leap, that's when the price responded directly to that scaling. And one thing that's really interesting about that story, though, is that most of that cost reduction happened on rooftops in a very, very distributed way. And that's what allowed for later day, larger utility scale projects to happen, is that the real progress was made in smaller distributed forms. And a lot of that happened within the metropolitan context. So that's what cities can do. They have diverse, rich economies that creates opportunities for many different sectors where the technology could potentially be adopted early. And that early adoption is what allows the costs to start coming down so that you can start to see more large scale deployment. And we're looking at that really the Carbontech in a very similar way. Can cities really sort of be the birthplace or the early incubation points for all these different forms of Carbontech? And so what you have across the cities, and what Adida is going to just give us a quick survey of shortly, is that we have many different niches, different types of industries where you can see carbon utilization or removal being integrated within cities. So it's sort of a hotbed of potential niches of early adoption. And then the other part, which we'll also talk about, is policy. You know, cities, particularly in the North American context, are the levels of government that have been most responsive to the climate emergency, or furthest along making commitments ahead of states and certainly of the federal government. And so they've already done the math, and they're already trying to implement solutions. And some of the policies that are causing that to happen are also creating space for Carbontech to be nurtured. And one of them in New York City, which is, we were proud, really put New York ahead of really any city in the world, was the Climate Mobilization Act, and a really important part of that, which we'll talk about, Local Law 97. It creates opportunities for Carbontech, and we'll get into that later in the discussion. And then, of course, what other policies can we look to? And I've already referred to our effort. We've already researched and drafted legislation that would create incentives for Carbontech in buildings in New York City that we hope to get introduced by January for the next legislative session. And here, what we're doing is we're following already a lineage of policy in over the last 2 decades in New York City that was passed through state law, where you incentivize building integrated technologies, be they solar, batteries, or green roofs, through property tax abatement. So we're looking to sort of follow on that tradition and apply that to Carbontech. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go ahead and pause, and I'm really happy to introduce Adida Chowdhury, who's a advocate member of Open Air, and she's going to give us a little bit of just a quick summary of some of the different Carbontech companies that are just starting to emerge, many of them already based here in New York City, just to give you a flavor of what we're talking about and how diverse of an emerging sector this is. Adida is one of the most active members of our Carbon City group. She's a senior in high school at Bronx Science and a climate activist, and she aspires to be involved in climate advocacy and policy, both in college and professionally. So really happy to welcome her here to give us a little bit of an overview of some of the really interesting companies that are in this space. Adida, you ready?
Yep. Hi, everyone. So a lot of this can sound really confusing for people who can't seem to visualize what Carbontech would actually look like in New York City. So here are a couple of use cases that I wanted to go over that I personally find really interesting. Firstly, we're going to go over Air Company, which is a Brooklyn-based company. And right now their technology also basically draws carbon from the air, and they put it into their first carbon-made products, which are hand sanitizer and vodka. And they've mentioned on their website, if you guys want to go check that out, that this is their initial market focus, but it's just the first step towards more large scale products, including carbon neutral fuel and other really cool products. Moving on, we have Carbon Quest, which is another New York-based company, but they actually already have a system up and running in Manhattan, and their technology basically captures CO2 from natural flue gas boilers in big buildings, and then they sell the carbon to industries that use it. For their first partnership, they actually partnered with New York's largest concrete block manufacturer, which is Glenwood Mason Supply, based in Brooklyn. And Glenwood then injects the carbon from CarbonQuest into their into their concrete blocks, where it solidifies and it'll stay forever, which is another use of carbon sequestration technology made by the Canadian company Carbontech. 90% of Glenwood's concrete blocks are sold here in New York City, making this an amazing example of how an urban circular carbon economy would work. Moving on, we have Arricella, which is also a brand-based New York startup headquartered in Manhattan. And the story behind Arricella is that it was started by an engineer who was a graduate student of Klaus Lochner at Columbia. For those of you who know, Lochner is considered the inventor of direct air carbon capture. And Arricella is all about very small distributed DACC direct air carbon capture in homes. And their initial business plan was to integrate that technology with rooftop solar to produce clean hydrogen from water through an electrolysis process, and then combine it with the carbon in that their system draws down from the air to create carbon neutral synthetic gasoline for cars. And all of this is really cool because it happens under the same roof, like all in one place. Moving on, we have Aether, which is, and I think as most of you know, New York City has a really large diamond district, and very soon you'll be able to buy diamonds that just aren't mined from the ground, but come from the air. Aether, which was found in New York, makes diamonds from carbon captured from carbon that's captured directly with DACC machines. And their plan is to use a portion of the profits from their high value diamond business to invest in large scale direct air carbon capture more broadly, which is very interesting. Moving on from that, we have Neua. What's cool about Neua is that they're based in San Francisco, and they actually just recently installed their first pilot in that city. It's a direct air carbon capture technology, so it takes carbon right out of the air, but it's also really modular and versatile technology because it can be built into and located within or on top of our buildings. And what's really interesting about that part of the process is they're basically pulling down carbon. The pulling down carbon is driven by integration with water towers and air conditioning equipment that are already on the rooftops all over big cities like New York. So it just uses something that we already have available. The carbon that Neua's technology draws down could be used for many other things, but their CEO, Josh Santos, actually presented last spring on a webinar that was hosted by OpenAir that I'm sure Chris will link down below, where he says that he specifically focused on using the CO2 for indoor agriculture and greenhouses in the metropolitan area to enhance crop growth. Moving on from there, we have Terrapower, which is a Finnish company based in Helsinki, Finland, but they are entirely ready to sell in New York. And their technology is built around direct air carbon capture, and it basically pulls CO2 out of the indoor air in offices. For the holistic benefits of this, there's obviously it's been proven to improve indoor air quality and to boost employee or resident productivity. But beyond that, Solterra replaces natural gas with carbon neutral fuel. And like Arricella, it uses an electrolysis process that splits hydrogen from water using electricity. The machine then combines the hydrogen with the CO2 captured with the direct air carbon capture module to make the natural gas substitute. And so basically it creates a low carbon fuel that improves air quality all in one soup. So it's like the total package. Moving on from there, we have Earthly Labs, which is I think the most interesting one here. And since New York has become such a hub of beer making, we have over 40 breweries in the city. The beer making process both generates carbon dioxide from the fermentation process, but also it creates carbon dioxide, also uses it during the bottling process. But the thing is, the CO2 generated isn't used for the CO2 needed, and the CO2 generated during fermentation often goes into the atmosphere, while the CO2 used for bottling the beer is purchased and then trucked, creating even more emissions in the process. Earthly Labs, which is based in Texas and with customers in western states like Colorado, closes this open loop, and it captures the CO2 from the fermentation and uses it for bottling. Excess captured CO2 can even be sold for other uses. In Colorado, beer makers are just beginning to sell this excess carbon to cannabis growers in the state who use it to boost crop production, which is really interesting. So it can be used through a wide variety of different markets. Moving on from that, we have our last company, which is Carbon Upcycling. And this is a company based in Calgary, but they have plans to set up shop here in New York State, thanks from a grant from the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And their technology basically uses a special reactor to embed CO2 into different industrial building materials where it's stored permanently. This includes common industrial feedstock materials like slag, which is a metal byproduct thing, which is used for a lot of industrial purposes, including a substitute for highly carbon intensive cement. The CO2 that they use can come from industrial sources, but ultimately this will come from direct air carbon capture. And embedding CO2 into materials like slag not only puts carbon in things instead of the air, but it makes those materials stronger. Thank you. And now I will pass it off to Sal Brzezowski, who will be going over the analysis on the offset problem.
Adida, thank you so much. That was excellent and certainly gives us a sense of, even at this very early stage, how broad and diverse the different types of technologies and use cases are that are starting to emerge in this thing we call Carbontech. So that was a great review. I appreciate it. And really excited to have Sal right now, who's going to give us a little bit of analysis and start to sort of place the conversation within the policy context, which is really important, particularly as Carbontech could potentially relate to offsets, carbon offsets, which is something that Sal will describe. Sal is a climate and energy policy specialist, and she's an advocate for open air, a very active member in our Carbon City group. And their background is in climate science communication, and she's a recent grad from the master's program at Columbia's new climate school. So Sal, take it away.
Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Adida. That was super interesting. Now that we've seen what Carbontech can do and how it can support a circular carbon economy, let's dig into some of the challenges of carbon accounting and offsets and why we care about them. Next slide. So we all know that the best way to reduce emissions is to stop burning fossil fuels, but as we work towards this deep decarbonization, there is value in utilizing carbon offsets to mitigate new emissions that can't be avoided and to draw down existing atmospheric carbon from historical emissions. This is especially important in New York City, which is both a major emissions hub and uniquely vulnerable to climate impacts, as many of us saw with the storms in August and September. So New York will allow some offsets for Local Law 97 compliance, but the criteria for these offsets is still under Department of Buildings rulemaking. So this definition of an offset here is actually directly from the Local Law 97 legislative text. And we will be hearing more about what they will allow for offsets as the Carbon Accounting Working Group releases more information about that. Next slide. So to understand offsets, we do have to understand a bit about how carbon behaves. The trouble with carbon dioxide is that it lives an extraordinarily long time in the atmosphere where it disrupts the global energy balance. This means that even after we stop burning fossil fuels, the planet will continue to warm until equilibrium is restored. Next slide. To complicate matters, carbon isn't the only player. Fuel combustion also emits pollutants like sulfate aerosols, which have a much shorter atmospheric lifetime and actually have a temporary cooling effect that counteracts some of the warming from carbon. And this cooling effect happens because the sulfate aerosols increase the reflectivity of the Earth's atmosphere. This reflectivity is something that's called planetary albedo, which I'll reference a little bit later. Since sulfate aerosols are a harmful pollutant and they're regulated by air pollution legislation, researchers have actually been able to trace relative cooling or warming associated with aerosol trends. Because of this, it's estimated that they're responsible for preventing several tenths of a degree of warming so far. And in the current state of the climate crisis, every tenth of a degree matters. But when we stop burning fossil fuels, the gap between the aerosol lifespan and the carbon lifespan could result in a disastrous spike in rapid warming unless we remove existing CO2. And there are several ways to do that, which we've heard a little bit about from Carbontech. And another popular way is through nature-based solutions, but those have their challenges as well, which is where Carbontech comes in. Next slide, please. So natural sequestration is currently the more popular method of carbon removal. It basically leverages natural processes to absorb carbon. So you've probably seen lots of tree planting schemes popping up in recent years and gaining a lot of popularity. But experts have calculated that there literally are not enough trees in the world to offset our emissions, and that there never will be. These finite natural processes have a limit to how much carbon they can store and for how long. So while they are super valuable, they pose a challenge when you're trying to account for all of that carbon. Trees store carbon over their entire lifespan, but they don't reach their peak potential until trees reach maturity. For the species of trees that have the highest potential to store carbon, this can take decades or even a century. If you've been paying attention to the IPCC reports, we know that we are approaching a very important deadline of 2030, where they recommend that we reduce global emissions in half by this date. So if we're trying to manage the carbon that's being emitted over the next decade before this deadline, how much carbon a tree can sequester over the next 100 years is it pales in comparison to the reductions that we need to achieve this decade. Next slide. So ultimately, the trick with counting carbon from planting trees is figuring out not just how much carbon is stored, but how long it takes to store it. Carbon that is emitted, avoided, or removed in the next decade has a more profound impact on the climate's trajectory over our lifetimes than carbon that is sequestered 50 to 100 years from now. Next slide. So if New York truly wants to offset or remove carbon, the quality of the offset matters. And this is something that we'll be seeing a lot of details on as the city releases criteria for eligible offsets. So what makes an offset? The long answer is a lot of science, but the short version is a few key factors that help assess how well an offset works. Next slide. So first is additionality. This is whether or not a project would have happened without this offset. So if someone is planning on planting a bunch of trees just out of the kindness of their heart, and they're going to do it anyways, you can't come along and say, oh, well, I'm going to pay you for this offset so I get credit for something you were already going to do. That means it's not additional. Additionality means it is a new project that only happens because of the funding from an offset. Next slide. Measurability. How much CO2 is removed? Measuring the CO2 that is removed through natural processes that are dominant in the offset space is actually really difficult, because CO2 isn't directly measured by just how big a tree gets. CO2 is stored in their trunk, in their roots, in their leaves, in the soil, and the soil actually stores over 3/4 of the carbon that trees take up. And so disturbing soil by doing mass tree planting schemes, you can imagine, has a lot of issues. Next slide. Timescale, how long does the CO2 take to remove? I mentioned this one already, but when you have trees that take decades to a century to reach maturity, that carbon removal that you're paying for in an offset today, that carbon's not actually getting removed until many years or decades in the future. Next slide. Duration, how long is the CO2 sequestered for? So the popular types of trees for tree planting schemes tend to be very fast growing trees because they want to see the removal sooner, but the fast growing trees tend to have the shorter lifespans. And so if we let them decay, that re-emits the carbon. If there's a forest fire, that re-emits the carbon. If we then chop them down and use them for biofuel, guess what? That re-emits the carbon. So based on the long lifespan of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, anything that is claiming to offset or sequester carbon has to last a really long time. Next slide. And finally, co-benefits. Does this project help or hurt local ecosystems, economies, and communities? So we have to consider what it does for overall biodiversity of the ecosystem. We have to consider if we are impeding the economic ability of the communities that these offsets are taking place in, and look at the big picture, not just carbon in and carbon out. Next slide. So the two major forms of nature-based offsets are planting new trees and preserving existing trees. As I mentioned with planting new trees, biodiversity can be negatively impacted by mass tree planting schemes, and tree lifespan affects the timescale and duration of carbon sequestration. I told you I was going to use that key buzzword albedo again, and here it is. So a surprising thing that a lot of folks don't know is that when you actually plant tons of trees where there are not supposed to be tons of trees, the dark color of the tree cover reduces the reflectivity of the earth, and that can actually have a net warming impact. So putting your trees in the wrong spot can actually increase global warming. And finally, land use change is already responsible for increasing CO2 concentrations. A lot of the existing carbon in the atmosphere is from historical deforestation and historical land use change. So reforestation can't really count as an offset for new emissions because it's really only making up for the historical deforestation. We've got a little bit of tricky double counting going on there. Next slide. And finally, protecting existing trees is a much more valuable offset, but when you're trying to build an economy on offsets for carbon reduction, then the existing trees are mostly reaching their finite capacity once they reach maturity. Trees reach what's called a steady state where the carbon that they're taking in from photosynthesis can actually end up balancing out the carbon that they're emitting through respiration. And so once they reach these caps, these mature forests can't really uptake any more carbon, and so you can't keep selling offsets for them. But they do still have to be protected so that it's not re-emitted. And finally, due to the uncertainty of future tipping points, a lot of these mature forests are at risk of turning into carbon sources rather than carbon sinks. So the bottom line, next slide, is that ecosystem restoration is vital to mitigating climate change, but for offsets, the math doesn't add up. In order for an offset to have value, the carbon that is emitted today must be removed today and stored permanently. Otherwise, we risk double counting, we risk losing the stored carbon in the future, and we risk total climate catastrophe. So that is why Carbontech has to play a role in offsets, and especially in places like New York City, where we are so densely populated and have massive, massive emissions. And I will pass it back off to Chris.
Great, thank you so much, Sal. That was excellent. I think just to bring it back, why this is relevant is the discussions in New York City right now around offsets and what is that going to look like, and are certain emitters of carbon dioxide going to be permitted to invest in afforestation, and is that sort of an ideal solution to prioritize given some of the weaknesses or vulnerabilities or uncertainties that you just outlined in great detail. And so it kind of raises a couple of questions. I guess there's both whether or not looking at solutions that are carbon removal and storage solution that can be urbanized, such as, let's say, direct air capture that pulls carbon from the air and then puts it in concrete, which will lock it up forever, or other current and future materials, but also whether or not cities should require or prioritize forms of offsets that are linked to carbon removal, like direct air capture that may be in other places of the world. Is that going to be a better way for us to, have more certainty that we're actually having the climate benefit and emissions benefit that we want? So that was excellent. I really appreciate it. So let's go ahead and do this. We do have some time left. I'm excited to, if the panelists want to go ahead and turn their cameras on. And I'm happy to pull in two other open air members, Adina Banian, who is a trained architect, a very active open air member, and also a sustainability consultant for Latitude Compliance here in New York. And her day-to-day job is looking at the local city laws, the local law 97, which will penalize or fine high carbon buildings that don't fall underneath a threshold. And she tries to help her clients figure out ways in which they can avoid those fines. So interested in Adina's sort of thoughts on how Carbontech and some of the solutions we discussed might have a future as a compliance pathway for Local Law 97. And also really excited to have Jason Hockman, who's not only an Open Air very active member, he was also the champion of our Open Air trivia contest once upon a time. So smart guy. He's the founding co-director of the DAC Coalition, which is a new industry group that's looking to support and advance direct air capture globally. But he comes from a public policy and a utility background. So he knows the city well and knows the regulatory environment well. So happy to have you, both of you join us, and we'll take some questions from the audience too. But I'm wondering, Adina, if we could just start with you real quick, if you could just talk a little bit again from the nitty gritty point of view where you sit at your desk at Latitude about the kind of problems that some of the Carbontech solutions that Adita presented earlier might, how they might solve problems for some of the buildings that you look at every day.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing is if you look at the penalties, like they are so high, and there's two different types of penalties. There's for reporting and there's for going over on your emissions. And I mean, I can tell you what that is. Should I get into it? Yeah, so like, let's say for a non-reporting, it's your whatever square footage it is, you have that, and that's how much dollars you're paying per month for not reporting. So let's say your building is like 60,000 square feet. That's like, $30,000 a month for not reporting. And then for excess on your emissions, technically they have a list of different, exactly the number you should be having. So it's that change of emissions times your square foot over 1,000 times $268. So we're talking about, let's say for the Google building, for example, in New York City, they have to pay like $8 million for 2024, and then there's 2030, which is up to like 10 million. So it really depends on your square footage, and it depends on how far off you are from your carbon limit. And this carbon limit is going to change over time, so 2030, 2040, 2050. So it keeps getting more and more stringent. And the reason why, I guess I'm tying this back in, why this is so important is basically it's really expensive. These penalties are really high. So we at Latitude are always trying to look out for incentives, trying to help our owners pay a little less, try to figure out ways that you can get exempted in some way. And one of the ways that there's three ways that you can get deductions. Is basically you invest in renewable energy. There's RECs. There's buying credits. You can invest in like a solar farm or wind turbine. But one of the ways is actually purchasing greenhouse gas offsets. And this is where this would fall into. And it's a 10%, which technically, if you look at it in a grand scale, how much penalties, it's actually a lot that you can get saved from. So we're definitely looking into this very seriously as options for our owners to help decarbonize their buildings.
Right. And one thing just to really stress is that obviously the spirit and the intention of the law is to encourage building owners to adopt ready technologies. Particularly, there's a focus on the electrification and the substitution of hydrocarbon burning, the utilization of renewable energy, efficiency, and conservation. And all of those are still absolutely the first order of business. But there are many buildings, I wonder if you could just verify this. There are many buildings that, particularly in the near term, are going to have a hard time economically pursuing all of those at once and still complying and avoiding fines. So when we look at Carbontech as potentially an extra layer for certain types of buildings where it might be economical to capture that carbon and come underneath that threshold rather than paying a fine. You see a certain segment within the customers that you serve there that might fall into that?
Yeah, 100%. Because in 2030, majority of the buildings are going to have to start complying. So you're going to, first of all, yes, you need to electrify your building no matter what. That's just something because you need to plug into the grid. But overall, it's having this as an option is really helpful to our owners who they can't make the retrofits quick enough. And they can't do, this is definitely something that it's besides the fact that it helps the overall, our environment, it's also it's helping owners and management companies and building owners, like they can lower their emissions in a much more effective way.
And it's not only just helping the building owners, the property owners, managers. These companies, they are still very young. They've got incredible, smart people working with them. They've got great ideas, and they've got great either products or processes that have a positive environmental impact, a positive climate impact, by being carbon negative, or in some cases carbon neutral, as one of the questions in the Q&A just noted, that sometimes there are products that, like in the example of the brewery, the carbon dioxide is re-emitted, but it's a neutral cycle. It has displaced carbon dioxide. I'm sorry, I'm struggling for the words, but it has a positive climate impact. But what I was getting at is that this type of law will help plant the seeds, or enable these companies to grow quicker by having the demand built in.
Yeah, so it's like, as you're saying, like Local Law 97, certainly it wasn't developed with the idea of incentivizing carbon capture, carbon removal, but it has that function essentially. And I think what Frederick Clark, who is the executive director of the Carbon to Value Initiative, just asked this great question, which Jason just alluded to, about when we think of Carbontech, it's really important to certainly think about the value of applications that remove carbon and then put it somewhere durable. That's a removal, and that relates to what Sal broke down for us. But it's also really important to look at what we could call the sort of climate beneficial use applications, where when you're using Carbontech, you're creating a circular loop, the reutilization of carbon, and you're localizing it. So it might be displacing a higher emissions form of, let's say, for instance, the example that Jason just referenced with beer making. So if you're bringing in carbon dioxide, you're trucking it into the city from outside of the region. There's a lot of emissions associated with that when you compare, let's say, a direct air capture machine that's located right at the facility, uses waste heat to run, and then you don't have to truck anything in. That, from a life cycle perspective, is going to have much lower emissions. So there's a lot of real benefit to various different Carbontech applications that aren't removals, but rather have a form of beneficial use. Just one quick thing to clarify, and I would like actually your opinion on this, Jason, because again, you're looking at this unfold, as are people like Fred, who head up the Carbon to Value Accelerator. They're seeing this sector unfold in real time at quite a fast rate. But one just quick thing I did want to point out, Antonio had asked a question about carbon upcycling technology. That's the reactor system that embeds carbon in slag and other construction materials that Dita referenced. They're agnostic as to where the carbon dioxide comes from. You had asked, where does the carbon come from? They can take carbon from post-industrial sources, but they could also take carbon ultimately from carbon that's captured from the air. So just wanted to clarify that in case that wasn't unclear. Jason, I'm wondering if you could, though, just kind of build a little bit on what Dita shared, which again was to present a survey of how diverse these companies and use cases could potentially be. I didn't know if there's anything you wanted to add to that from your vantage as somebody who's really looking at these businesses sort of enter the market on a monthly basis.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that this space is at such an interesting point right now. The Direct Air Capture Coalition, which will be launching at the beginning of 2022, and just to make a slight amendment to what Chris said, we're not an industry group per se, as more of a multi-stakeholder coalition that sees direct air capture as a critical tool to help address climate change. And we want to help educate, engage, and mobilize the key actors in society towards deploying this technology. And so we've been, to the best of our ability, keeping track of all of the different direct air capture startups and initiatives that are seemingly every day, we're getting wind of. And think our list is up to over 30 direct air capture startups that exist globally. And they all seem to have different variations on, they have the same basic end result in that their technology can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, but they utilize different methods. So there are companies that utilize temperature swing or moisture swing or electro swing, and those are all different processes that are chemical, temperature based, electricity based, that can remove carbon dioxide from the ambient air. And they have different models for what they can do with that carbon dioxide. So they can partner with sequestration companies that can store it durably, permanently underground. As Adida alluded to, you have Arricella, which turns it into usable fuel on site. And it's just a really fascinating area, because this isn't science fiction. These are real companies that have real applications, and having laws in place, creative policies like the Carbon City PTA can do a real service in helping these companies gain ground and build some traction.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that is interesting that you could see in Dita's survey, and I sort of explained more in the abstract, is if you were looking at this tiny carbon removal and Carbontech space just a couple of years ago, it was far fewer companies, but there was almost sort of an exclusive focus around large industrial scale of deployment, which is necessary and has a really, really important role to play. But I think many of these companies that we're seeing come online, there's sort of a shift towards modularity and integration with applications. And that obviously opens up opportunities for cities like we described. And it really is quite remarkable, just in a very short period of time, the number of companies that have started to surface. I think that just looking at some of the, did you have something you wanted to add to that, Jason?
I just want to address the question about, are they carbon neutral or use more energy than they save? They are all, this would not make any sense if it was not removing more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere than whatever source of energy is being used to conduct the process. So direct air capture, for example, the largest facility in the world that recently opened in September in Iceland is fully geothermal, zero carbon energy powered. Obviously, the nature of that facility is different than some of the things that we're talking about, but all of these processes, it would make no sense, and no one is going ahead with any methods that rely on burning coal or fuel oil to power these processes. This is all carbon negative in terms of the DAC versus the life cycle assessment of energy input.
And that's something that Sal's presentation, in addition to the actual tech and the innovation that has to occur around there, is obviously the evolution of the methodologies by which we're able to measure precisely not only what's being captured, but what's the net embodied carbon of these solutions. So the life cycle analysis piece of this is absolutely critical. So we have visibility on what the actual, it can quantify what the climate benefit is. And I don't know, Sal, if you had anything you wanted to add to that, but that's obviously as much a part of the conversation as the technology is itself, is how do we account for it in a precise way?
Yeah, not much to add to that. You basically nailed it. The methodologies are evolving because this is a very new industry, it's new technology. And so paying attention to these methodologies and learning how to assess what is good carbon removal is vital towards actually getting the real climate benefits, as you said. Like you mentioned, the one technology that uses waste heat recovery, and Solitaire uses solar power. We also are going to see, as the grid gets more green, so as we start using more renewable energy on our electric grid, the what's called the carbon coefficient of electricity will go down. And what that means basically is that the number that we multiply the amount of electricity that you use by in order to figure out the carbon emissions associated with that electricity, that goes down the more renewables we add to the grid. New York just announced 2 massive renewable projects that are being submitted for PSD approval that would be bringing more renewable energy to New York City than we lost from the closure of Indian Point. So we have a massive input of renewables that are coming in as well.
Great. Well, we have a lot of questions here, and Jeff Greenspan, a regular of our This is CDR as well, has given us a lot to think about. I'm sorry, Jeff, there's zero chance I'm going to be able to get into a lot of these, but really, really interesting. So I think just to, one other thing I wanted to also point out is that I mentioned it before, but if you take a look at the Carbon to Value Accelerator website and look at their cohort, every couple times a year, they have a new group of startups that are coming in, and it's a fascinating barometer, I think, of how this is diversifying, that you just see all across an intersection with different sectors. It's really quite fascinating. One of the things I just posted in the links below in the chat are, if you can go to the Carbon City videos there on our YouTube channel, we're going to be posting this webinar, but we also have other content that we put up there. And we actually had a great interview that Sal and Adina did just the other day with the company Solitaire, which has been mentioned. That's a DAC, building integrated DAC that creates synthetic natural gas and pulls carbon out of the indoor environment. That's a great discussion, a short 15-minute discussion with their CEO, Petri Lasko. We also have another kind of virtual walkthrough with the Carbon Quest team, showing their installation right up near Central Park, which is capturing carbon from boilers. And that's the carbon that's being used in Brooklyn in concrete manufacture at Glenwood Mason. So you can look at those links, and we're going to be posting more of those each week to get real insight into who these companies are and what they're doing, which I think is really, really fascinating. You can also take a look at our resource page, which is has a whole bunch of information on carbon dioxide removal, both on the technology side, but also on the policy side, on the moral argument side, as well as featuring some of the leading thinkers in this space. So we'll continuously add to that as well. But that is a good place to start if you're new to this subject. And the last thing I want to mention, if you look at the Open Air website, and we have the join section there, I started off our conversation by saying that Open Air is an entirely volunteer-driven network. And our theory of change is that you can pull in folks from all different walks of life and background and interest in different places and accelerate progress in ways that organizations and startups and government by themselves probably won't do. So that is an open invitation to folks that are already part of our community to please click on join there and come on in, and we'll let you into our Discord server, is where we hang out. It's a lot like Slack, and we can introduce you to other folks, and you can get involved quick. As Sal and Dita and Adina and Jason will tell you, it's you can get involved very, very quickly and really get to work. So I want to end with that, but I want to thank the team here. The folks you heard to today are really all part of our Carbon City team. And we wanted to just start circulating and getting this information out there, but please do come inside, become more active. And again, I want to thank the team. Thanks, Sal, Adina, Jason, and Dita. And thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.